Hello everyone, this is Space Cafe Podcast, and I am Marcus. Space debris. In search of the appropriate introduction for this episode, for whatever reason, I have to think of my two children. Order and disorder, and the merciless dictate of entropy. Translated into my everyday life, it goes like this. On the weekend, we clean the house. On Monday, there are a few harmless socks lying around. I counter with the request to put them away. On Tuesday, a few toys join them. Here too, I'm able to still assert myself with a little emphasis. On Wednesday, school books and toys are appearing out of nowhere. The children tell me they are tired. I have mercy. Too late for countermeasures. On Thursday, a tent is built and added to the other day's debris. I admire the work of art and hold back. On Friday, a friend comes to play. I give up, and the cycle begins again. My very private Kessler effect, or something like that. In space it is similar, only without adults. Here, only children seem to hang around. For 65 years, we have been treating space between Earth and the Moon like our nursery. And every year, more toys are added. And when the batteries run out or we don't need the things anymore, we leave them lying around. Permanent Wednesday or Thursday, to keep the aforementioned analogy alive. At some point, an adult tagged along and said, "This can't go on, guys." In 1978, 20 years after Sputnik, NASA scientist Donald Kessler described that space debris can become an uncontrollable danger. Today we are faced with an almost uncontrollable pile of rubble, and good advice is expensive. Very expensive indeed. Where to put the hundreds of thousands of pieces of garbage? We've long been aware that the damage done is irreparable and that the near-Earth orbit will never be completely virgin and clean territory again. But at least the coarsest junks should be removed somehow. A handful of companies have dedicated all their power to this incredibly challenging task. And one of them is ClearSpace.
So my name is Luc Piguet. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of ClearSpace.
Developed at École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne and grown at the ESA Business Incubator in Zurich, Switzerland, and now one of ESA's hottest candidates for the job. CEO Luc Piguet is my guest today and possibly the man who will one day to be said to have helped secure the future of space travel altogether.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Luc Piguet.
At ClearSpace, we pick up debris from orbit. We essentially develop in-orbit servicing technologies to make space operations more sustainable.
So you're sort of the garbage collector.
Yeah, I would say the tow truck actually, rather than garbage collector, because we're not really looking at picking up all the fragments that are up there, but more removing complete satellites or rocket bodies that are out of use or not functioning anymore.
Nice. So for our audience, to get us going, I would like to frame this conversation with three very simple questions I'd love to find answers to throughout the next couple of minutes and maybe hour. So the first question would be, what is the problem? Second question is, how can you solve it? And the third question will be, when is the job done? So let's start with the first question. What actually, Luc, is the problem?
The problem has multiple dimensions. We have been operating in space with the constraint we had in the past, right? For years, we were launching only very little number of satellites or rocket bodies into orbit. And at the end of the life of a satellite, there was no real need to remove it. We would just leave it there. And so,
what's the lifespan of the average satellite?
So in operational lifespan, depends a lot on the satellite. It can be a few months. It can be up to 15 years. Usually it's not much more than that. And then there's some objectives now. There's some guidelines now that said that after the mission, the satellite should be, at least in low Earth orbit, be removed within 25 years after its mission in orbit ends. So what happened is that for many years, we were just launching satellites into orbit and not really removing them. It was also another propellant that was necessary to remove it. It was already challenging to operate. And space was big and there were really few satellites. And as we were moving on and more countries started launching satellites, it became more crowded. And in the 70s already, some system engineers at NASA predicted that if we continue like this, we will end up having collisions with broken objects, and they could generate fragments that could then generate other collisions and then generate a cascading effect that would affect or could affect the complete space operation and put us in a situation where we might actually just not be able to operate in specific orbits because it becomes too dangerous to get a collision. And the problem happens also because for a satellite to remain in orbit, it needs to go really fast, right? It needs to go at 28,000 kilometers per hour. 28,000 kilometers per hour is a speed we cannot be achieved on Earth.
It would be like three times the speed of a bullet, right?
Yeah, I actually never did the calculation from the speed of a bullet, but yeah, it could be. It's about 7 kilometers. That's the speed they go. And if you go slower than that, then you start falling. And if you go faster than that, you start moving away from Earth. So this is more or less the speed where you are in the Earth's orbit. And at this speed, any object carries a very high amount of kinetic energy, right? The kinetic energy is the energy an object carries is the mass by the square of the speed. And you have very high speed, which means that even a fragment of a relatively small size will have a massive impact on collision, right? It is, if you take an object of about 1 centimeter, it could have an impact similar to a hand grenade explosion on impact. And the problem is there's more and more of those objects. So over the years, we started accelerating the number of satellites we launch in orbit. And we got to a point where the number of debris started increasing more or less exponentially. And that's the situation we're in. And as time was passing by from the 2000 up to 2020, the situation became more and more alarming. And then at the same time, we launched many more satellites now than we did a few years ago. To give a comparison, it's like if the space would be a very high-speed motorway network with no tow truck service for 60 years, right? You would have cars broken all along the road, and they would present a huge danger for other vehicles on the road. And that's the situation we have in orbit right now.
I took the liberty to Google the speed of the satellites, of your average satellite as compared to your average bullet. And so if you take, for example, an AK-47, the average satellite would travel at 10 times the speed of that bullet. So this is insanely crazy. So if you take, for example, your favorite action movie and take a look at those sniper guys. So you would multiply that bullet by 10 times. And you would get the speed of the satellite.
And actually what happens at that speed is that when you have an object traveling at this speed in the atmosphere, you have a pressure wave forming in front of it. And because of the law of perfect gases, the temperature would spike, it would become really hot. And then you've got friction. And with that, objects just burn up in the atmosphere. And actually, when satellites re-enter into the Earth's atmosphere, they burn up. And this is the reason why the Dragon capsule needs a heat shield to be able to survive because of this speed. So you cannot actually not produce this speed in the atmosphere. It's not possible.
Fascinating. So let's just go back to the kinetic energy you were talking about. So you do not, in order to produce a really dangerous problem, you don't need a car-sized or truck-sized item like a satellite in orbit. You would just need a very small piece, like a piece of a square centimeter, that could pose a real problem.
Or a few millimeters. So even an object of a few millimeters can perforate completely a satellite or the propellant tank, for example. So it can have a life-ending, present a life-ending risk for satellites and obviously for astronauts in orbit. And the problem is, every time you have a large object that either explodes or collides in orbit, and that happened a few times, thousands of smaller debris and fragments. And those debris, they continue orbiting at very high speed and they remain a very long time in orbit. So this population of small debris increases over time. And from the ground, we're not able to really track objects that are smaller than 10 centimeters. Now we have new tracking methodologies that bring it down to about 4, but still we have very high level of uncertainty about where those objects are. This means that if you have a satellite in orbit where there's a lot of those small debris, you actually can't avoid them. You can't avoid them because you don't know where they are. And
so how many pieces are out there on average?
There's different figures depending on how it's calculated. If you take just a tracked object in Earth orbit that are monitored from the ground, it's about 23,000, and those are the bigger than 10 centimeters. If you take statistically the number of estimated by ESA, I think the last figure is like 39,000, but there's hundreds of thousands of smaller pieces of debris, and from millimeter size debris up, it's millions of those. And the problem is that in some orbits, if you take the orbits between 700 kilometer and 1,000 kilometer, we can already start seeing the Kessler syndrome appearing, which means that the number of objects is increasing, even though we didn't really add more satellite in those orbits.
Kessler syndrome, meaning that if it's like a cascading effect. You have one piece of debris hitting another one that produces in turn 4 pieces, 16 pieces, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. And actually a satellite generates thousands of pieces of debris. If you take the Cosmos-Iridium collision that happened in 2009, it generated more than 2,000 trackable pieces of debris in this one collision of 2 satellites. So there's a multiplying factor, which is dramatic, right? On Earth, if you look at prevention versus recovery in disasters, for example, I don't know, you have a fire or you have a hurricane or any natural disaster, the estimates by UN is about the investment in prevention saves you about $1 invested in prevention saves you about $17 in recovery, right? More or less. Recovering costs much more expensive. Now in space, this factor is much bigger because it becomes extremely difficult and expensive to go pick all those small shards and pieces of debris, which start spreading around multiple orbits all around the world after a collision or an explosion.
Say, Luc, what does this mean to live satellites, maybe also to the ISS in orbit right now? Do they have to zigzag around their trajectories to avoid collisions? How does that work in reality?
They actually do that. So there's a catalog of those debris, their estimates of where they are. One of the problems is that every single catalog and tracking from the ground is an opinion about where the debris is. It's not the exact position. We know where it is with an uncertainty, which means, for example, about 2 kilometer cross track and 5 kilometer long track. So you have some sort of an overweight where the object could actually be, but you're not sure. So what operators do is they receive the conjunction notifications to decide whether yes or no they're going to make a collision avoidance maneuver. And as time passes, there's more and more of those collision avoidance maneuver and more conjunction happening. And those numbers are increasing very quickly. This means that every time there's a risk like this, an operator decides to avoid the debris, he has to spend propellant. So this reduces the lifespan of the satellite because you have to make a maneuver, you have to spend propellant, you have to change your
invest
orbit.
Energy.
Exactly. And the ISS does that also on a regular basis.
So can you give me an estimate, Luc, how empty or not empty is space anymore out there? So is it like for every football field or, I don't know, 10 football fields, there's one piece of space debris? How can I make this relatable to me as a human being who has never been to space?
Yeah, actually, there's not that many. If you look in absolute number, it's not that many, right? It's not that many debris. It's if you would put 2 bottles of Coke in the Mediterranean Sea, right? It's not that many. The problem is that they go that fast that they orbit once around Earth every hour and a half. So it's not so much about how many objects, trackable objects there are, and that we talk about the trackable objects, is how often do they cross their path, each other's path. And that's very often. And then how long does this operation happen? So if you have a satellite that fails, or a rocket body that is used rocket body located at below 600 kilometers, it will be back into Earth's atmosphere within 25 years, right? You take the Starlink constellations at 500 kilometers, 550, it's about 1 to 5 years. It takes for a failed satellite to get back into Earth's atmosphere. That happens because there's still a little atmosphere at those altitudes, right? So every time the satellite collides with some molecules of atmosphere, it slows it down a little, and it degrades its orbit over time. But if you're above 600 kilometers, very quickly you go to 100 years. For example, we have the Swiss cube in orbit at 700 kilometers. It's going to stay there for about 80 years. But if you go up about 1,000 kilometers, then it's very quickly more than 1,000 years in orbit. And if you go higher up, then it stays essentially forever. So if you have a debris or a satellite, a failed satellite that fragments in specific altitude, those debris will remain in orbit for 100 years. And they will cross paths of other objects for thousands and thousands of times across all those years, because every year, hour and a half, they do a rotation. And
fascinating.
This produces, so the Kessler syndrome is not something that happens like this. It's something that can be sparked, and you might see the effect 5 years later.
Wow.
Right? And it starts building up over time. Slowly, it's a crawling process that progresses slowly and accelerates over time. And that's the challenge with it, is that once it's accelerating, then it's already essentially too late. It makes it difficult.
Too late.
Yeah.
Wow. Luc, you're making this so visual to me. Thank you so much. You're explaining this so vividly. And I'm already getting seriously afraid of what is happening up there. And I could totally imagine that this was the origin story of how you started to pitch that beautiful project one step at a time. I think you started pitching it at ESA Business Incubator in Switzerland, and then up the ladder. And at some point, you ended up getting the attention of ESA. Was it like this?
It was actually a little longer than that. What happened to us is that in 2009, the team at EPFL launched the Swiss Cube, the CubeSat, actually still operational today, which is very unusual for a CubeSat. It's a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter satellite. And I think it's probably holding the world record of durability in space for a CubeSat, which is quite impressive, thinking that we used mobile phone batteries on it. So
it's Swiss perfection.
It's been well designed. Let's put it like this, well designed. And so this CubeSat was launched on a rocket launcher from India called the PSLV. And when you launch a CubeSat, you can't choose at the time, and still today, you could not choose the orbit where you go. You have a main satellite that goes in a specific place, and you're just hitchhiking along. And the one that we actually hitchhiked along was at 720 kilometers. And so on the day of the launch, we received an email from ESA saying they cannot participate to our mission because at 720 kilometers, the Swiss Cube would need about 100 years to get back into Earth's atmosphere. And that was out of the guidelines. And we were shocked by it because we were not expecting that. And then the other thing that happened is that because we were exactly at the same altitude at this collision that happened between Cosmos and Iridium in 2009, we were in the field of debris. So we received a lot of those conjunction notification from the U.S. Air Force telling us, hey, your satellite might actually collide with something in 48 hours. And that created a lot of intensity around the problem for us, and led actually Muriel and the team at EPFL to start a mission to go pick up the Swiss Cube. So this been started in 2012, so it's a long time ago. And for years, the team at EPFL tried to drum together funding, and nobody would pay for it. Everybody would say, who would ever pay for that?
Would people listen? Would people be aware of the problem? Or would they say, Luc, you're exaggerating?
Yeah, at the time, people were less aware of the problem. One of the things I noticed is that one of the things that was happening is that you would receive a conjunction notification. Let's say you receive a message from the U.S. Air Force saying, "Oh, you will pass at less than 100 meters from a Fengyun 1 debris, debris of the Fengyun 1 satellite, which was a Chinese satellite. The Chinese used for an anti-satellite missile test in 2000 and was it 2011? I think so. I'm not sure. And so you would think 100 meters is very little, or 40 meter, right? You think, oh, it could actually be right in front. There could be a collision. And we don't have propulsion. So we would sweat overnight. We would pray and hope nothing happens. And next day it's true and say, okay, fine, it's true. But nothing would ever be published. And in most of the operator would be the same. The operator has this crisis moment where there's a team working on the orbital dynamics, trying to find a solution, then decide whether they do a maneuver or not. And there's a huge amount of stress. And then it gets through, there's no collision, everybody breathe and go back to work. But the decision makers that actually should take decisions of financing or budgeting for that kind of solutions is never informed. So we had this discussion with Muriel and thought, let's start publishing the conjunction notifications. And said to everybody, hey, we could have collided last night. We could actually have collided. There was a very big risk of a collision last night.
Wow.
And we've seen that not so long ago. ESA started doing this too, where they published when there's risks of collision with Starlink or with other operators, because we have to make people aware that this is a very rapidly growing problem now. And there's another thing that happened is that when I met Muriel, it was just after OneWeb announced that they raised $1.7 billion with SoftBank for their 2000 satellite constellation. And we looked at it and we both came to the conclusion that this was not a singular event. This was a trend. This was the future of what's going to be done in space. And there were several reasons.
But here we're not talking about trash. We're talking about future trash.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, like constellations, that's still active, live gear in space.
Yeah.
That's not yet trash, but it will be at some point.
We're talking about making sure that the way we set up the complete infrastructure plans for contingencies, right? We have contingencies on the ground. We have contingencies on the motorway. We have tow trucks, right? Cars can fail. Everybody knows. We all know that cars can fail, that anything can happen on the motorway. And you need tow trucks. And we have tow trucks. Ships can fail. And you need tugboats to be able to move ships when they fail. So you have contingencies, you have maintenance, you have solutions for that. And the space industry doesn't have those contingencies today. And so we looked at it thinking, what is the economic business model that can be placed behind removing failed satellites or making sure that we actually clean up this environment that can actually also make it financially sustainable? Because it's not just making it sustainable in terms of environment, but also making the operation financially sustainable. Because otherwise, how are you going to do it? So when we met with Muriel, she showed me her project to pick up the Swiss Cube and the Pro Space.
So who's Muriel?
Muriel Richard is my co-founder. She's been working for years at NASA JPL on interplanetary missions, and then joined EPFL, where she led the Swiss Cube mission. And she also led the CleanSpace 1 mission. So she was working on this project for years before we created ClearSpace. And at the time when we met, she showed me the evolution of space debris in orbit, and it looks like an exponential. And so we talked about the CleanSpace 1 mission, and I told her, so what do you want to do? You want to go pick up the Swiss Cube, or you want to remove all the debris? And she said, I want to remove all the debris. Right? That was ambitious. So
that's ambitious.
You cannot do that without a business model. You need a way to finance this. So it has to make sense.
So Luc, this is like seeing the great garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean, the great garbage patch that's like the size of France and Germany combined, whirling around in the Pacific Ocean. So you're seeing this as a stepping stone towards the real thing, and the real thing being space and cleaning up space.
So I think we see that as two different problems that are equally important. right? The great garbage patch, we have to address it. We cannot let that hang around. And actually, we have to address the source of the problem. We have to do two things: clean up and address the source. And in space, we have a similar situation. The question that people ask us sometimes is, why should we spend this money in space now when we have the garbage patch in the ocean, right? Why should we do that? But that's a paralyzing argument. That's an argument that stops progress. And there's a very real reason why we should do it for space. It's because without the space infrastructure that we use every day, we use it. We are not able to do the garbage patch problem we're not able to address the sustainability problems we have on the ground without space infrastructure today. We monitor pollution, global warming, weather effects. We monitor overfishing. We monitor a huge amount of things that are fundamental for sustainability out of space. And without this infrastructure, we would just not be able to know where we stand and what needs to be done. And so this is an infrastructure which is like a foundational block of our way of life. If you
I'm sorry for interrupting. I think it's not just only observation. I think it's also about making the world we live in possible in the first place. This is why we need space infrastructure. So the infrastructure in space is a vital part of our everyday lives. And we're not just talking about the usual GPS and ATM money or cash withdrawal machines and technologies. We're also talking about syncing our clocks and making trade possible, making travel possible, making everything possible, making supply chains, making communication, making everything possible.
Yeah.
So space is a vital part. So it's not a surplus. It's a vital part of our everyday lives.
So exactly. And this is the reason why we cannot actually wait for this problem. This has to be solved now. We cannot say, okay, let's do the ocean first and then we do space. This is not an option.
Sure.
It's not an option we have today. So we look at it, and I think there's a lot of past objects that should be removed. There's about 5,000 non-functional complete objects in orbit, according to a study by Darren McKnight, of which a big part are rocket bodies. There's about 2,700 rocket bodies, something like this, and the rest are failed satellites. And those are relatively, many of them are large objects. And so the problem there has to be addressed for the past, and sustainability has to be built for the future. This means we have at the same time to build a tow truck service that works for large constellation and future space operation, and that it makes it possible to remove old cars that are really problematic or in very problematic places. Yeah.
Sure. Luc, we have a big problem. We have a big vision, but now let's try to bring this into reality, in your reality, that is. How can you solve this ginormous problem? So what is your approach? What is the approach of ClearSpace?
So our approach is, first, when we started working on the problem, we were completely technology agnostic. We didn't know what the right technology is to actually address. Is it a throw net? Is it a harpoon? Is it a robotic arm? Is it a claw? Right? What is it? We were completely technology agnostic, and we just made a trade-off. We looked at all the implications of the different choices and made a choice and said, okay, this one is the one that makes sense. And so for us, I think the first step, what needs to be done, is to demonstrate that the complete value chain of that kind of operation can work. So you need a first mission. That ESA came to the same conclusion, right? The Adrios program, or the ClearSpace One mission, is the materialization of that. And the other thing that needs to be done is that we need to retire non-recurring engineering costs. And we need to do that because we have to bring those services down to an affordable price. If the cost to call the tow truck on the motorway would be $200,000, then you would have an excuse to leave your car there. Yeah,
sure,
but I cannot pick it up. I don't have that kind of money.
Sure.
So one of the elements is that it has to be brought to an affordable cost. And then we have to put the business models behind it that make it work, right? And there's many business models exist in other industries for if you take the car comparison, you have ADAC in Germany, for example, which is an insurance plus service. In Switzerland, it would be TCS. In the US, AAA.
So it's 60 euros per year?
Yeah. So you have essentially share the burden across a large number of users, and then you have an insurance plus service, and it brings the cost affordable to everybody. So insurance is a model. Insurance plus service is a model. It could be an offset, like the carbon offset. Why not? So there's a lot of models that we already have on Earth. It's just a question of selecting the right one and getting. So this is not the business model. Everybody says it's too expensive, right? There was an article in Space News saying, "Oh, it's way too expensive because it costs. It cost. How was it? 10 million per kilograms, right? Because it was 100 kilogram. No, 1 million per kilogram. They came 100 kilogram, 100 million. The mission." So one of the article would say it's 1 million per kilogram, so it's too expensive. And then we had the discussion saying, wait a minute, that's investment. We're not talking about the service cost, the recurring service cost. We're talking about what we're investing right now to develop the technology. And that's not at all the same thing. And most of the space operations require a lot of investment at the beginning. And this investment is necessary. What we have right now is a situation is that ESA demonstrated first that they're ready to invest and that they're ready to invest serious money into making this a solution, into finding a solution. And the interesting thing with the ClearSpace One mission is that it will solve a lot of questions. First, can we get a launch license to launch a debris removal mission? The first license will be given by ESA. How do we do the rendezvous? How do we do the implementation? How do we find the object in space? How do we handle the liabilities around a mission like this? There's so many questions around that can be addressed in one single mission because it does the complete value chain.
Luc, why don't you run us through an actual, now theoretical, but maybe possible future situation where a piece of trash, of space trash, will be removed with one of your technologies. So how will that work? So what kind of technology are you employing for that mission?
For the first mission, we develop a spacecraft that has a substantial amount of propulsion. So it depending on the mission profile, today there's so many options of propulsion. You can choose whether you put one or the other electric propulsion, if you put chemical propulsion, if you put coal gas, you have a lot of choices of propulsion. So we build up a spacecraft with propulsion and robotics on board. So there's an actuator, a mechanism that makes the capture possible. We launched this space robot.
You need that propulsion because you have to go after your target. So you have to catch it in the first place. This is why you need a lot of propulsion.
Yeah, and actually you need substantial delta V because you have to go up and down, and then you have to do close proximity operations, right? So you've got the rocket launcher that places you in an orbit, maybe 500 kilometer altitude can be an example, where you can do all your to make sure everything works, right? Before going higher up, you stay at the lower orbit to make sure everything works. And then once this is done, you're going to wait until you're aligned with the orbit of the target you're going to pick up, right? Because you have drift that happens on different altitudes. So you can choose altitudes wisely and align with the object. And once you're aligned, you go up to the operational altitude. So you have to
28,000 kilometers per hour.
Yeah, you're orbiting all the time, 28,000. Exactly. So what you do is you accelerate so you go up to the altitude of the object you have to pick up. And then you have typically far range rendezvous operations, which means that first you have absolute navigation. This means you navigate based on the absolute frame of reference of the Earth. And based on the TLEs and space track and the catalogs of object, more or less where the object is. You can also do observation from the ground with telescopes where you can do precise measurements. So you get closer, and then once you have it in line of sight, then you switch to what's called relative navigation, right? This means that your satellite starts to adjust its speed and orientation and motion to the object it's going to pick up so that it can get closer and closer to the object. So you would typically approach the object in what's called safe orbits. And those are orbits that rotate around the motion of the other object because...
So this is in fact what ESA did with the Rosetta mission.
Yeah.
So that would be a comparison, right?
That's just best practice, right? You want to avoid collision. And if for any reason your satellite stopped working in this operation, you will never collide with the object, and that's what you want. And then once you get close enough, you start making hops to get closer and closer to the object, down to a place where you can actually do an inspection. Where you can inspect the object, you can estimate and calculate its tumbling rate, if it's got any, how is it rotating, how is it moving, and choose your approach strategy for the capture. Then the next step is then initiating the capture, which is autonomous, right? The capture, many operations down to there will be autonomous, right? And then at the capture is there's a moment you have to take a decision, okay, we go for it, then you get started. And there's a point of no return where if you stop the operation at that moment, you will still collide. You're too close, you're moving, you're too close, but all those will happen really slowly, right? That's a few centimeters per second. So that which reduces the risk of breakage or collision or anything with the other object. Then once you close, you actually simply, in the case of the first mission, we just close the capture mechanism that envelopes and holds the object. We secure it. And then what we do is we stabilize the complete stack. Then we slow it down. Because if you slow it down...
But this is an autonomous mission at this point, right? This is not done via a joystick from Earth.
No, this is autonomous. Yeah.
Okay.
So they are commands sent through. There's some sort of a red button where you can stop the operation. You've got some safe fallbacks, and it's obviously supervised because it's a really complex exercise. It's very difficult to do. It seems easy at first sight like this when you see the video on our website, but it's really complex because you're in an environment that has no gravity, so you're microgravity, so everything is free floating, and there's no friction. So you can have a 3 tons object and you just give it a nudge and it starts spinning. And so because it holds to nothing. So this makes the capture operation really challenging. And a lot of work has been put into how do we actually pick up those objects in space. So once we have it, we captured and secured, what we do is then we just slow it down. And what you can do different strategy. You can linearly slow it down and little by little enter everything together, or you can place it into what's called an elliptical orbit. So you bring the perigee down closer to Earth so that it gets into the Earth's atmosphere right? So every time it passes through the atmosphere, the Earth's atmosphere, it's slowed down and then it gets a little less high until it gets in an uncontrolled fashion. So there are different strategies for that. So the first mission, we're actually going to sacrifice the spacecraft that we developed with the debris we go pick up. But our objective is to build a reusable platform, right?
So this reusable platform will, once the target object is caught by Earth's atmosphere, the platform will then let go of the target object and push itself away.
Exactly. And back
with its own thrusters.
Exactly. And get back up to waiting altitude and operational altitude. And then you can repeat operation with another object. So the objective is to get to a point where you can remove multiple objects for a single mission. And the reason why you want to do that is because this allows you to divide the cost, right? Because the big part, there's a few cost dimensions you've got in a space mission. One is the launch, right? One is the production of the platform, of the tow truck, if you want. And then one is the operations. So typically the launch and the tow truck are quite relatively expensive systems and important costs. So if you can reuse them for multiple missions, then you obviously benefit from it and you can reduce costs for that kind of operation, which is our objective.
So completely understood, makes complete sense, is totally obvious, and is a no-brainer. So
it's relatively simple, actually. I'm sorry it's not more magical than that.
No, absolutely. But now, I think now, to me as a layperson, in contrast to you as being an expert in that field, I see that as a first stepping stone towards the next step. And the next step that could be, is it possible to not only deorbit satellites which have run out of fuel or whatever the problem is, but to recharge satellites, to repair satellites in that fashion and make them or give them an additional lifespan? So would that be possible in the first place?
Yeah, actually, this is possible. Today already there's some missions doing this, right? You have Northrop Grumman is doing that with the MEV 1 and 2 mission, where they extend the life of geostationary satellites. And geostationary satellites are platforms that are developed for very long lifespan, but then they're limited by the quantity of fuel they have. And because they're on the geo ring, and if you don't use propulsion, you don't stay on straight on the ring, you start drifting, right? Your orbit starts to be affected. So you always have to use propulsion to maintain you, to do your station keeping, to make sure that you actually stay in the slot so that all the antennas on the ground can always point to the same place in the sky. So you need propellant to make sure that this actually works. And so after 15 years, the satellite has no more fuel, right? So what they need to do is to remove it from there and send a new one. And a new platform is 150 million investment.
Wow.
So if you can have a tow truck that actually just picks up this satellite still working and just holds it in this slot for 5 more years, then this can be a very attractive business case for geostationary.
But seriously, how would that work? Like, would this, let's say it's a robot, the platform is a robot, would that robot just open a bunch of screws on the target satellite and get out the empty fuel cell and insert a new one? How would that work?
No, what actually they wanted to do is they grab the satellite and they hold it. And they use their own propulsion system and their own attitude control system to point it in the right direction and keep it. And they just hold it. That's all they do. If you want to refuel a satellite, there have been some projects to refuel satellites in orbit or to repair satellites in orbit. And it's a very challenging exercise. Already on the ground, it's difficult to assemble a satellite. You need to do it in a clear room. You need to X-ray your piping of your propulsion system to make sure there's no gas bubbles or anything in there. You have to make sure that it's quite a challenging exercise. And so and there's another thing with satellite is that usually the external surface is covered with what's called MLI, which is an insulation material, which is typically this golden kind of golden sheet on some satellites when you look at the images on internet. And this is actually to make sure that the thermals inside of the satellite remain in a controlled benchmark, right? So if you start opening up the MLI, then you affect the thermals of the satellite, right? So you start affecting a lot of us. And so there's a lot of impact of doing this. I think the complexity of that kind of operation, the risks of that kind of operation is sufficiently high for it to be too expensive. And so I think probably for the future, what might more likely be the case is having refueling valves installed on the platform before it's launched in some cases. And then having a refueling operation, and there's some startups working on that kind of model. The question is which operators will want that. There's another dimension when you want to extend a satellite in orbit is how obsolete is the satellite already at the moment of the extension. If you look at the generations of telecommunication technologies, you had 3G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, or the different generations of Wi-Fi, they have very short cycle, like 2 years. 2 or 3 years.
So you would need to have a possibility to upgrade your satellite.
Exactly. So this means that if you wanted to extend the life of, for example, a telecommunication satellite, you would not just have to refuel it. You will also have to upgrade its transceivers and its antennas and maybe adapt it for other frequencies or add some other capabilities on it. So when you do this complete calculation, the question is it cheaper to launch a new satellite than extend an old one? And sometimes, depending on how you do your trade-off, you get to the conclusion. It's actually, sometimes you come to a conclusion it's better to extend the life, right? Television is an example because it's a very stable technology, right? And there's a huge amount of households in developing countries that use still satellite television. But then in some technologies, updating a satellite is sometimes more expensive than actually just sending a new one.
Sure. Say, Luc, let's go back to the orbiting technologies that ClearSpace is after. So how long can I imagine such a mission to deorbit one piece of space debris takes on average?
An average is difficult to express for a simple reason, is that if you have to drift a long time, right, if you have to wait until 2 orbits align, depending on the kind of drifting you need to do, you can wait several months. To be able to align with the right object in the right place, you can need several months. But let's assume that you're injected just in the right spot, a little like what's done for refueling the ISS or sending the Dragon capsule to the ISS, then it can be relatively quick to just to deorbit one debris. It can be a couple, or it could be even a couple of weeks. But you have to be very precisely injected where you need to be in that case.
Okay, now here comes. I said it's a no-brainer, your business model and what you're after. But here comes now the devil's advocate. Now, we learned a couple of days ago that Rwanda, for example, filed for 330,000 satellites at the ITU. And this is just the beginning of something that is developing in space, especially when it comes to constellations, etc. So we have the old garbage, we have new satellites that will soon become old garbage. So now, if you say it takes a couple of months to deorbit just one piece of space debris, and then now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pieces of space debris. Like, how feasible is the project that you're after? Or are you saying that you will ultimately employ thousands or 10,000s of ClearSpace platforms in orbit?
I can turn the question around, right? I can say, imagine you're at the beginning of the automotive industry, right? You start having roads and there's more and more cars and there's no tow truck. And then you build a tow truck and people tell you, but your tow truck can only drive 700 kilometers in distance and it takes so many hours to do the 700 kilometers. How do you think you can solve the hundreds of thousands or millions of cars that are going to be on the road with your tow truck? Actually, the tow truck is an industry. It's not one company, it's not one servicer, it's an industry. What we're doing here is building a new industry. It's the beginning, it's the genesis of a new industry. In a new industry, there's going to be multiple players, there's going to be multiple actors, there's going to be many servicing spacecraft in orbit all the time, consistently. It's an operation where it will just be a normal part of, if you take all the satellites we're going to have in orbit, let's say in 30 years, 10% of them or 15% of them are going to be servicers. And it's just going to be normal that it's like that. And when you scale up like this, then you can make this environment sustainable. Otherwise, and it's really, I think I like the relation with the car industry, because the first guy that invented a car, probably everybody laughed about him saying, where is it going to drive? There's no road, right?
Sure.
Right? This is a ridiculous invention. And he would say, but this is going to transport materials and goods and people, and it's going to bring you really far, and you will be able to travel with your complete family in there and go for holidays and come back in a week in places where now we need 2 weeks just to go there. And the point is, it's really hard from where we are usually to project ourselves into the future and think, okay, what will it be? We're really good at rationalizing the past, but really bad at predicting the future. And for me, the best way to do that is to look at what happened in other industries and think, hey, would that be feasible? Mm-hmm. And you need to have some ideas of science fiction behind that and think, okay, let's imagine out of the blue what the science fiction future would look like. And then from there, you walk back. Because if you don't do that as an engineer, you tend to only look at the close possibles, right? And that's one of the problems of the engineers. They look generally only at the close possible, because you know what you can do now, and then you look at what you can do next, right?
Sure.
And you need also this dimension of looking at, okay, what is the future 20 years down the road? How is it look? And you might be wrong, but that's okay. And you just make a plan which is very much science fiction, and then walk back from there. So when we look at it, and when we look what's necessary to be able to actually operate that scale of constellations, is you need an industry to serve them.
When are you ready to demonstrate the capability of your first platform experience?
So we are, this ESA mission, the ClearSpace 1 mission, has as objective to fly in 2025. That's the target that we have. So it takes quite some time. And there's a good reason for that, because it's like, often investors ask me, but can't you do it in 2 years? And what we say is, you can either develop a go-kart, or a Formula. What we do is
for the Formula One.
What we need to do is a Formula One. And you don't develop that in 2 years. You just don't, right? Because it's a 700 kilogram platform This is already quite a satellite. It's quite a complex system, and it's what's needed. We cannot just do that with a CubeSat. It's not feasible. You cannot do that, run that on a CubeSat. You need a different level of onboard processing power. You need a different level of propulsion, of robotics, of dynamics, behavior, and so on. So it's essentially a Formula One. But at the same time, we started working with UKSA for a second mission, right? So we initiated activities with UKSA on the phase 0A for a mission 2. We also work on other applications of on-orbit servicing. Once you're able to rendezvous, to navigate in space, do relative, absolute and relative navigation, do autonomous navigation, do rendezvous and capture in orbits and manipulate, and you can do many other services. You can do life extension like MEV, for example.
Luc, as you're now working with ESA on that next project, do you at some point, or have you already called up the Rosetta people and asked them for advice, how they did it and how you can learn from it?
Yes. So actually, one of the value of working with ESA is they have an incredible pool of engineers. They're incredibly competent, and we're grateful. It's an understatement, and incredibly lucky to be able to work with those guys, because they bring so much value in the exercise. And it's not just Rosetta is one exercise, but then there's the ATV, for example, that did autonomous docking with the ISS. And so that there's a number of missions ESA has been working on where we can just talk with the engineers over there and debate strategies, how to address one problem or another. And then the other aspect is that ESA pushes us to be better. ESA forces us to lay the foundations that are really necessary to sustainably build an operation like this, and to be able to get back then to, for example, a launching state and give the proofs that our operation is safe, right? That what we really looked at the problems of failure. We looked at the fear event. We did a complete fear event analysis. We evaluated everything that can fail in our platform. We really know what we're doing. And ESA essentially pushes us through a very rapid maturation phase on this first mission.
Nice. So what is at the end, at the bottom line of your Excel table, when will space be clean and virgin territory again?
I think we will not get to a space that is virgin territory. We're just not. We're not going to get there. We're not going to get there because there's so many small fragments in orbit already that we're not going to get there. But where we can get is to a space that has a stable environment, that is sustainable over time. And over time, a long time, smaller fragments in lower altitude, they will come back relatively quickly, but in mid-altitude, little by little, they will get down. It will take a long time to do that, but we have a stable environment. And that's going to take time. I think that's going to take time, not so much because of the technology itself, but more because of the fact that mindsets have to change. The way we budget space mission has to change. When we budget a space mission as an agency, for example, we should take into account the fact that this spacecraft might have to be deorbited at the end of its mission externally. And this means that you plan for this budget. You put a contingency in so that if that happens, you have the money to actually pay for removal.
But this is also something that we haven't talked about this yet, and maybe this is not the show and the episode that holds enough space for that kind of debate. But ultimately, it's a matter of space policy, because you're a service provider.
Yep.
So you're not a policymaker.
I'm not.
You're a service provider to get rid of an ongoing problem. And the ongoing problem has happened because of the lack of space policies. Now, I think in parallel, this is something that needs to happen, that in the future, not any more space debris is being produced, so that you and ClearSpace can focus on removing the existing and the past space debris. Would that be right? Am I understanding that's correct?
So I think there's two dimensions here. The first one is whether in the future we will get to a point where we don't produce any more space debris. That's not realistic. There's going to be failures. They're going to be unavoidable. And they're always going to be part of the exercise. What we can do is reduce the number of failures, make it more safe. When it comes to policies, we're not doing policies, but what we know is that it's very hard to put a policy in place for something that doesn't exist. And it's almost impossible. If I say, you have to, if there were no tow truck, and the policymaker for the car industry would say, from now on, if your car fails on the motorway, you have to remove it. You can say, I can't. It's impossible. You actually put in place a policy that cannot be implemented. So it's not applicable, so it's not enforceable. You cannot do anything about it. So it's really difficult to put a policy in place if there's no technical solution for it. So for us, it's obvious we have to create the technical solution. Then how it's going to be implemented in terms of policies, we don't know yet. We hope that most operators and agency will also by themselves realize how important that is. And I think not only for policy reasons, also for public opinion reasons. More and more people don't want to buy unsustainable stuff. And this is becoming a very visible problem in the press. Now, we want to be there to help find solutions for that and not really push in one direction or another. So there's another idea about policy that I found interesting. I heard one of the attorneys of ESA present that. He said, if you look at the car industry, everything, he showed a picture where you can see a red light and traffic and signals. That everything in this picture is regulated. The number plate, the size of the characters on the number plate, the color of the red lights, how they work, how priorities work, the signaling on the street, everything, the maximum speed, everything is regulated. And it's not regulated to make the industry impossible. It's regulated to make the traffic agile and safe. So the question...
What most people do not know, because of course none can remember because we're not that old, that in the early days of auto traffic, there were no policies in place and people would drive on whatever side of the road they wanted to drive. There were like different regulations for different countries and different, even within the countries, they had different regulations. So I think we are pretty similar in the early days of that auto traffic. I think that could be a nice comparison. And now we are ready because we're producing ever more traffic. And now we're in the situation where we need regulations to get a functioning traffic into the future.
Exactly. How do we make this traffic fluid and safe? That's the question.
Luc, I have one last question to you. And this last question is super open to your imagination and may have nothing to do with ClearSpace. It's all up to you. This is called Space Cafe Podcast that we're doing here. And a coffee place, as we know, in Europe is usually going together with a good taste of coffee, maybe. And maybe some people prefer having an espresso. An espresso is something that energizes body and mind. And now I would like you to give us an espresso for the mind, a shot of inspiration you would like to share with us.
Yeah, so one thing that comes to mind is if I look at everything we did from the beginning when we started, and with my wife, we literally decided to burn our ships and to completely derail my career in what we're going to do and go clean up space at some point.
What was your career back in the day?
Before, for a while, I was in charge of technical sales for Latin America for traceability systems. Then before that, I was in the event industry doing networking solutions. And then before that, telecommunication, but nothing in space. I didn't do anything in space. And there's a moment where we had to decide what we're going to do next. And we decided to go clean up space. And I remember having this discussion with my wife where she told me, what do we have to lose? And I told her, we have everything to lose. We're going to lose everything. All the money we have. Tonight, there's a 99% chance that we fail. And we might lose everything. And what I realized looking back is that I would trade this decision for nothing in the world. It's been an absolutely incredible adventure up to here. I just feel grateful that I could live through it. And I like this sentence that really drove our decision-making as well, which is what is said by Ed Catmull, the founder of Pixar. It says, you never stumble on the unexpected. if you stick to the familiar. And if there's one thing that I'd like to share, is that most of the incredible projects are not done, not because they're not possible, but because we think they're not, and because we don't try. And across the complete history we had with ClearSpace, we simply looked at the problems and tried to find solutions. And we tried, even though it was looking impossible. We decided, okay, let's do it. Let's make it happen. And if there's something I'd like to share, and I think hopefully to younger audience or anybody that thinks about starting a project, is that the only reason, the prime reason why projects don't get to where it's supposed to be, or change doesn't come where it's supposed to be, it's because people don't try. This is the major reason. And yeah, it's been, I think we took this decision. It's been a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of stress, a lot of months where you don't know how you're going to pay your bills. And it's been a consistent problem, but it's been an incredible adventure. And I think I would recommend doing that to anybody.
Wonderful. Luc Piguet, thank you. Thank you very much for that super inspiring grand finale of our beautiful conversation. You're the co-founder of ClearSpace, and it was a wonderful ride to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to everyone who joins and listens to our Space Cafe podcast. This is very much appreciated because it's not something that can be taken for granted. Thank you so much for giving us your valuable time. If you like, leave us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast. This is an invaluable help for all us who work on this product and strive to provide you with the quality you expect every other week. So if you have a moment, jump over to your dedicated platform and leave a review or a couple of stars if you like. Thank you so much for your loyalty. I'm looking forward to the next episode. Stay tuned. Bye-bye.